With the person of Jesus coverall, then, you're going to have to write small. The boxes are not sizable with this one, so you're going to have to write small. You're going to have to summarise, please, because we have got quite a few slides to go through. So please keep your notes as short as possible, because we do want to do the last one as well today, at least start it. So, top first box is actually for 2 slides. So there's not a lot of space, but the 2 slides are quite brief, and it's just about introducing this idea of Jesus as divine or human. So we start with a quote from Zeffirelli. So you can either paraphrase it, you can just put in the box the quote if you want, or you can write it really small, it's your choice. But Zeffirelli, who was an Italian state senator in 1923, says this quote. He said, "Christians have no problem accepting Christ as holy, as God, but they always have problems accepting him also as a human being at the same time." This is the first part of this topic. This topic is split into 3 sections. Christ, or Jesus, as divine human, Jesus as teacher of wisdom, Jesus as liberator. So this is to do with the first section, Jesus as human versus divine. And so what Zeffirelli is arguing there is Christians have no problem accepting Christ as holy, as part of God, as part of the Trinity. What they have problems with, or what they question, is how can Jesus be human at the same time? How can Jesus also be human? Within the same box then is just for these bubbles, and so you don't have to get them all down. These are just rhetorical questions that you can ask in your exam. You can never answer the question, was Jesus human, was Jesus divine? That's not the point. You're not going to conclude answering it. The conclusion is which argument is more convincing. So this is within the same box, please. Yeah, so same box. So was Jesus free to choose what he did? Did he know he was the Son of God? Was Jesus' knowledge human knowledge, or was it of all creation? What extent was Jesus' divine knowledge? Did Jesus know about God? Did he know? Could he hear things over the other side of the world? Did he know everything that was happening in existence? Did he know that he was the Saviour? So these are just a selection of questions to do with Jesus as human and divine. Once again, an examiner is not expecting you to draw conclusions. It's about you asking those right questions. How much was Jesus divine? How much was Jesus human? If Jesus was human, did he feel pain? Did he feel pain when he died on the cross? Etc, etc. The next couple of slides will help bring this together as well. So this is just about whetting your appetite, especially with things like an introduction. Box underneath then is separated as you see it on your page. You have the top part of this PowerPoint slide to go in the long thin bit. Jesus the Son of God then. This was a title given to Jesus in the NT New Testament and by the early church. The early church called him the Son of God. The New Testament called him the Son of God. This links to the ideas of Christian doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation. Incarnation meaning God becomes human, God becomes flesh. Jesus himself never called himself Son. Jesus never called himself Son. Jesus always, though, referred to God as Abba, which was Greek for Father. So Jesus called God Father, but he never ever referred to himself as Son. He was called Son by other people. So this goes in the long, thin part at the top, going into the 2 boxes underneath, obviously for human and divine. So if Jesus was human, there are a number of problems. If Jesus was both fully human and fully divine, a hybrid, don't call him that in the exam though. So if Jesus was fully human and fully divine, such as in Paul's writings, he said humans have sinful and corrupting natures. So, did Jesus have a sinful and corrupting nature too? If Jesus was human, think of Augustine. Augustine said we're all born with sin. Does that mean Jesus was born with sin as well? We don't know. You can ask these rhetorical questions in your exam. on the other side, in order to save humanity from sin, Jesus had to be divine, as only God has redemptive power. Redemptive meaning can redeem you, can save you. And so if Jesus said, I'm dying for everybody, I'm dying for everyone's sins, he has to be divine to some extent, otherwise how can he have that power to do that? You don't have to put divine with a capital D, but it is recommended, especially if you are talking about Jesus as divine or as God, because divine is another word really for God. Problem though, if Jesus was God, did Jesus really suffer on the cross and actually die from crucifixion? How can you kill God? So if Jesus was God, how can God then die? Does this mean the resurrection then wasn't real? If the resurrection wasn't real, well, the resurrection was what instigated and formed Christianity. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, hence the Zeffirelli quote. Hence the problem between the holy nature and the human nature. Little bit underneath is just for what the churches say. The Church of Chalcedon in AD 451, Christ has two natures which come together in one person. So we're talking 451 years after Jesus' death. So we're talking a long, long time ago for us. They recognise Jesus as both truly God and truly man. In the Ecumenical Documents of Faith in 1899. Now, you don't have to remember where the quote is from, because obviously ecumenical is quite a mouthful, certainly spelling-wise as well. But even just the quote, truly God and truly man, really, really nice, simple quote to start an essay with, if you don't want to use the Zeffirelli one.
Is that the same principles adopted now in churches that he is well?
Yeah. Because otherwise it's too much of a Pandora's box to start going down these. They just accept it as both. Excellent. Boxes underneath then. Two boxes for two different views. Possible solutions to Jesus' nature. The first is from theologian Karl Rahner. He suggests a genuinely human consciousness must have an unknown future. What he means is, to be genuinely human, you cannot know of your future. You cannot have an awareness of the future. We don't know what the future holds because we're human. If Jesus had his Father's awareness of all time, he can hardly be called human. So if he had, like the Boethian idea of time, how can he be human then if he has knowledge of all time? And so Rahner presents the solution of the onion. Best analogy ever. Love this analogy. He says, yes, that's what all students then say, Shrek. But it's exactly the same. So Shrek stole it from Rahner. Jesus versus the onion. Onions have many layers of skin, so maybe Jesus' human self-awareness was the top layers and the deep layers were his divine consciousness. Just like when Shrek talks about being an ogre. It goes in the, so Rahner goes in the first one's answer and then the person at the bottom is going to go in the second. Yeah. Yes, you have comparisons to Shrek. You cannot use that in your exam though. Does anyone know any other arguments this sounds similar to? Freud, in what way?
Kind of like the iceberg, so what he's aware of is on the surface and below is what he's not.
Excellent, fabulous, Libby. So it's the idea of the iceberg, what you're aware and what you're not aware of. Yeah, spot on. Box to the side is for Gerald O'Collins. He challenges the possibility of the possibility of answering these sorts of questions, the sorts of questions of, Did Jesus know he was divine and human? How much was Jesus divine? How much was he human? Those sorts of questions. Because understanding the inner experience of Jesus' life is very, very challenging. Particularly because Jesus didn't write anything himself. I think that's still questionable. Jesus was educated, he could read. Chances are if he could read, he could write, which makes you think that Jesus did write something, and the chances are he just didn't want it in the Bible for whatever reason. But what Gerald O'Collins is arguing there is, it's very, very challenging to know the inner experience of Jesus. Jesus himself probably didn't know. So how on earth are we going to know whether Jesus was divine, human, or both? What he says is, what did Jesus know about himself and his mission? He knew that he stood in a unique relationship to the Father, and that as Son, he had a mission of salvation for others. So Jesus knew above all else that he was here to save us. Once again, you don't have to remember all the names, because the next, at least the next slide, if not the slide after, have a lot of names on them. You don't have to remember all the names, it's what you do with them. It's how you adapt them towards the question. It's how you evaluate them that's important. It is better to learn one argument and do an awful lot with it than remember all of them and do nothing with them. Excellent. Box underneath then, we bring in our fellow Scarborian, Mr. John Hick. John Hick recognised that if Jesus was only aware of God's will and God's willingness, he's no different from many others. So many others, Moses, Jeremiah, Muhammad, peace be upon him, Guru Nanak, St. Francis of Assisi, all of these people had an awareness of God. So if Jesus was just one of them, he was one of many. So what John Hick is arguing is he has to be the incarnation. He had to be God made flesh. Otherwise, he was no different from anybody else. So in order for Jesus to be different, he had to be God incarnate. Doing really well, everyone. Box to the side is for C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis has written some fabulous books as well. There's one called Mere Christianity that I highly recommend. I think it is on the bookcase actually. C.S. Lewis found faith as he grew older. He rejected the idea that Jesus' moral guidance can be separate from his divine nature. Basically, him being a guide or a teacher and divine, or human and divine, cannot be separate. They are part of the same person. For C.S. Lewis, he gives the example that he rejects anyone who believes he was just a teacher and not the Son of God. And he gives the example of a poached egg. Yes, so we have an onion and a poached egg now. So, C.S. Lewis says this. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would be no great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil in hell. That should be wood on the last bit. Now, you don't have to write the whole quote down. That's not the point. The point what C.S. Lewis is saying is, if Jesus was just a moral teacher and was coming out with the things that he was saying, he'd be a lunatic. I've never known a lunatic compare themselves to a poached egg, but this is what C.S. Lewis compares them to. So he obviously knew some lunatics that thought they were eggs. But what he's saying is Jesus had to have some divine element. Jesus had to have some divine nature behind him. Otherwise, he would just have been a lunatic. Or he was a lunatic. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But C.S. Lewis, from the standpoint he was coming from, was saying that he wouldn't be a great moral teacher, because why on earth would a moral teacher then lie to such an extent? So he wouldn't have been a moral teacher. You can't have moral teacher and not divine, because if he was just a moral teacher, there's nothing moral about his teachings, because he would just be a liar. So he has to be teacher and divine. Otherwise, he would just be a lunatic, like the man who says he's a poached egg. This is the densest part of the PowerPoint. Once we've done this side of the sheet, the other side gets quicker. So you are doing really well. The final section for this third of the topic is miracles. Miracles represent the divine nature of God. So miracles, the top part goes in the first part of the box, the blue bit goes in the second half. Jesus' power to walk on water, power to drive out demons, recreate sight, speech and even life are things only God can do. Therefore, Jesus was God, or Jesus was God incarnate, or the Son of God. So the things that Jesus could do could only be done by God. Therefore, there must have been a divine element to him. Christians believe miracles happen today through the Holy Spirit. However, Hume's essays on miracles, that's where we got the quote from on the last PowerPoint, a wise man proportions it to the evidence. Hume, however, says that because we have no present-day direct experiences of miracles, it's not possible to say that Jesus walked on water. Yes, Dynamo did it, but Dynamo did it with mirrors and with glass. It's a bit like saying Darren Brown can read minds, so he can't. He does a lot of subliminal messaging. He manipulates what people see. And so either Jesus was a con artist, or if they were true and the things that he did was real, then he has to have had some divine nature. But what David Hume argues is there is no evidence. On the other hand, maybe these miracles should be seen in a metaphorical or spiritual sense rather than literal. Maybe they're just metaphors, that Jesus looks at a quality, that Jesus was there to help people and listen to them. Maybe the blind man seeing again was metaphorical to say that he found his faith, that he wasn't actually blind and he found his faith. Is spiritualising God. However, the important question to ask, and do write this down, what were the gospel writers doing when reporting miracles? Don't forget, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the four gospels of the Bible, four gospels of the New Testament, they write about Jesus' miracles. What was their aim? What political move were they doing writing about these miracles? What sort of influence were they trying to have? And so it's actually thinking about as well, where did the books come from? Why did these people write these things? What were they expecting the response to be? NT, right in the bit next to it, discusses how Jesus cures people from groups that were excluded by society. Jesus is reuniting the socially excluded, the ritually unclean, the people separated in separate groups back to a relationship with God. He says that Jesus' miracles show a greater authority than just simply power to alter the universe. This is an extremely important point from Wright. What he is saying is that Jesus didn't just help anybody. Jesus didn't help the people that were rich. Jesus didn't help the people that were popular or that he could get a step up in society, or step up the ladder. Jesus helped the people that were outcast. Jesus helped the people that needed helping. The homeless, the lepers, the paralysed, the disabled, the depressed. Jesus helped the people that needed the help truly, even if it went against what society was expecting. The box at the bottom of the page, I ran out of space. So you have quite a large slide with not much to write. So you're going to have to summarise and maybe go back to this, because you have to know your miracles. You have not got enough space to write what's on the next slide. If you want post-it notes, I'm quite happy to put in a post-it note. That's absolutely fine with me. But I did run out of space a lot on this PowerPoint. And I didn't think you'd like a sheet that had a staple in the top. So, the 3 boxes at the bottom are for the 3 miracles that we looked at. These 3 miracles are the bleeding woman, the healing of the blind, and the resurrection. So, first of the little boxes is for the bleeding woman. That's for the first box, so you can pick which bits you want to write in that box, hence why the box is extremely small for what you've got there. Jesus often overturned social norms. He had women followers, and women were mentioned in a lot of the Gospels. Jesus heals the woman through touch. This was scandalous. A woman touching Jesus, a woman touching a man without permission that wasn't her own husband, they could be stoned to death for that. So when Jesus walks past and the woman touches him, Jesus says, "Who touched me?" I mean, you would, wouldn't you? Who touched me? Okay? And she said, "I'm sorry, Christ," but and she explains her problem and everything. And then Jesus heals her. Jesus forgives her for touching him, because it was quite, again, like I said, scandalous. But Jesus didn't then, he could quite easily have gone, "This woman touched me," and she'd have been stoned or executed in some way or banished from society. And so the point of that one is not the fact that he actually healed the bleeding woman, it was the fact that she was a woman and he helped her. Men were not supposed to have friends in women. Men did not hang out with women. Yet we know for a fact that Jesus was very, very close to women. His mother Mary, Mary Magdalene. He had 12 disciples. Chances are he had more, and they will have been women. Chances are the Marys will have wrote scriptures and gospels. They'll be somewhere in the Vatican. But Jesus was inclusive towards women. Of course he would be. It wouldn't be about equality and then ignore women.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Can you say that? So, when you're evaluating the composition of the Bible, is it a conspiracy theory to say that they're keeping them behind?
No. What you could put is that it's certainly suggested, yes, that it suggests that there's books written by females. I think is there a Channel 4 programme at the moment about Jesus is females? Yes, so you can certainly suggest it, because these women were also educated and were with him. They were the first people that Jesus saw after his resurrection. They were of great significance. The chances are they will have wrote something, and it's more. We also know that the Bible, and bringing Rose around for Ruther to say how the Bible was selectively based upon male approaches. Fine. If you want to say something like that, bring in Ruther, because she'll have said it somewhere. Yeah, really good point. Middle box is for healing the blind. Jesus himself identifies his action as God working through him. Jesus never goes, "Am I brilliant? Look at me, look at me." No, Jesus always passes his miracles back to God. The miracle was not automatically accepted. The point of this miracle being here is the Pharisees, the people in charge, didn't believe what Jesus had done. They even criticised it and checked up on him. So, even today, we'll learn about the miracle of Jesus healing the blind, and you'll say something like, was he really blind? Did he really do that? The people at the time did the same. The Pharisees investigated to find out whether the blind man was actually blind. What they found out was he was actually blind and can now see. They still rejected it though. Of course they still rejected it, because the Pharisees and Jesus did not get along. Jesus was pushing against them all of the time, and you'll see why later on in the PowerPoint. But even when they investigated it and it came up that he was blind and he can now see, they still rejected it. Final bit for this bit. Resurrection. For Paul, if Jesus was not resurrected, then all the preachings would be in vain. Sins would not have been washed clean, and at death all would perish. And so what this means is, if Jesus didn't really come back to life 3 days later, all of the work the disciples did in preaching the message, all of the work would be in vain, because he didn't really die for our sins to be saved, and therefore we're all going to perish in hell. Wright suggests that the belief that Jesus rose from the dead was the reason why Jesus' disciples regrouped. So Wright argues that the reason why after Jesus died and came back, that's why people thought, we have to get together, we have to preach the word of Christ. So it was the coming back, it was the resurrection that brought about Christianity. The resurrection itself discloses in a new and startling way the suffering, the new life, and the unconditional love. It shows the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. It's the final revelation of Jesus that I'm coming back and you'll all be given spiritual life. It is a miracle. It reveals the glorified, transformed being. All of this linked to death and afterlife, which is the last one that we'll do. And it also shows that anybody can understand this. The weak can mediate God's revelation, so we can all work out God's revelation through it. That's Jesus coming back. You don't need to mention all 3 miracle stories in your exam. You certainly do not need to retell of the story. This is about what is the deeper meaning, what is the revelation, what is the point of why the Gospels writers write about it, what can we learn from it. It's about how it shows Jesus as liberator, as teacher, as divine human, not about retelling the stories. Yeah. So God in the Bible, so God through Christ, God was never seen suffering. We never saw God suffer. So God was in pain, and his son that he'd sent was crucified. So it shows God in a different way. It shows that we are promised new life in this unconditional love, that Jesus has died and given his human life to save everybody's sins. So it's a new way of seeing God that we haven't seen elsewhere in the Bible. Okay, we're going to take 5. Right, second side, second section, second section of Jesus. This is Jesus as a moral teacher or teacher of wisdom. So top box is for this slide. Jesus is often seen as a moral example, so he's a role model, and he advocates. Advocate means supports or promotes. He advocates repentance, saying you are sorry. Also forgiveness. If someone says they're sorry, you forgive them. Spiritual purity, being pure in your spirit. Repentance, saying sorry, so repenting when you've done something you should have. When you've done something you shouldn't, saying you're sorry. And then forgiveness is when somebody actually does that, then forgiving them, yeah. Advocate loving others, healing the sick, looking out for outcasts, the vulnerable and the dispossessed, so looking out for the people that are not treated fairly by society. Also advocate the message of good news. The message of good news is that you'll be saved from sin and promoted with or given heaven. So reborn into an eternal life. Even Richard Dawkins woke up the right side of the bed one day and in a Guardian interview in 2011 said Jesus was a great moral teacher with no sarcasm. Jesus is seen as a rabbi. A rabbi is a term of respect used for educated teachers who interpreted the law of the Bible, the law of the land, etc. So don't forget, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Christianity came once Jesus had died. So Jesus was the king of the Jews. He was a Jew, and therefore a rabbi is a term of respect for Jewish people. Jesus clearly could read and spent a lot of time preaching in the synagogues. He also used controversial and surprising stories designed to get his listeners to think about their preconceptions. Preconceptions are when people judge based on no evidence at all. And so often Jesus would use controversial stories to get people to listen, to get people to remember, and to really highlight the silly things that people think. That's it for that first box. This question did come up last year in the first round of the first year questions. I don't know the question specifically, but it's something along the lines of Jesus as moral, a moral guide, a moral teacher. So to what extent was Jesus a moral teacher or something like that? So this question did come up last year. Whilst this PowerPoint is very long, it gives you loads of substance to write about, whereas natural and revealed theology doesn't really have that much to get your teeth into, nor does Christian moral principles. There's not a lot to get your teeth stuck into, whereas this one, at least you have those three clear sections: the divine human nature of the divine human nature of Jesus, the Jesus as the teacher, and then Jesus as the liberator. So this quite easily could come up again. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this comes up again in the exam. Just because it came up in the first year does not mean it won't come up for you as well. Box underneath then is the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon is where you give teachings or preachings. Mount means it was on the side of a mountain. It was on a mount side. It was on a hillside. This is where most of Jesus' teachings can be found. It's in Matthew's Gospel 5-7. It contains most of his teachings, and it starts with the Beatitudes. These are blessed are. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and those who are persecuted for righteousness. If you missed the Sermon on the Mount, you missed out big time. If you pulled a sickie on that day, you missed all of Jesus' teachings. In an exam, if you're writing something about Jesus and you think, where did he talk about this? Just put Sermon on the Mount, it'll be in there somewhere. Everything Jesus spoke about pretty much can be found in the Sermon on the Mount somewhere. You do not need to remember all of the Beatitudes. I recommend 2 or 3.
Are there any that you think are more important?
No, it depends
Just
on...
how you're arguing.
So, yeah, it depends what you're arguing. Yes, exactly. So, poor in spirit means people that are a little bit down on life, depressed, anxious. Those who mourn, cry, so maybe cry over bereavements. Meek, people that are quite mild, timid, quiet. Merciful, people that show mercy. Pure in heart, not just doing good actions but having good intention. So that one is the pure in heart is a bit like good interior exteriors for Aquinas. The merciful is a nice link to things like mercy killing and euthanasia. So you have got overlaps here in some of your application topics as well. Hunger and thirst for righteousness, people that do things like hunger strikes in order to do what is right. And finally, are persecuted for righteousness, people that are persecuted or even die for doing what they believe in. At the end of the day, we have so many people in history that have died because of doing what they believe is right. Look at the American presidents. All the American presidents that have been assassinated over the years, those have been the biggest advocates of black rights or human equality, etc. So people that are persecuted for doing what they believe is right. Quite deontological in their approach. They focus on the intentions, not just the outcomes, and you can find the golden rule there as well. So treat others as you want to be treated, or do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Now you have 5 columns underneath. These are for the 5 main teachings from Jesus, or the 5 main ways you can summarise Jesus' teachings. So the first of the 5, you don't have to number them and you don't have to order them, it's any of them, but these give you a really good structure for an essay. These give you something to plump it out if you run out of ideas. So the first is, of course, agape, so that goes in the first column. Agape was an idea of unconditional love, very, very promoted throughout Jesus' teachings. Love thy neighbour, love your enemies as yourself. This is not physical, sexual or emotional. St. Paul then used this, so St. Paul took on the ideas of agape and promoted them around Christian communities that were squabbling. St. Paul, again, a bit of a busybody, went around all of these different communities who were all squabbling. Oh, he said this to my wife, he's stolen this from me, he owes me this. And St. Paul thought, for goodness sake, I can't keep coming back to all these problems every time I visit you. So he said, Just focus on agape love. Just show unconditional love to each other and all your problems will go away. Agape love is more subjective and applies to individual situations and new demands, and of course it was most recently developed by Joseph Fletcher. Second column is for justice, mercy and forgiveness. He argues that we must treat others fairly and fight, not physically fight, but fight as for people's rights. Fight for equality of others. Forgiveness should come first, and we should not judge others without looking at our own shortcomings first. If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. I'll explain the story in a second because it's really important that you do know this. So this goes in the second column. So, what happened with this story was, at the time, we know in the Ten Commandments, one of the thou shalt nots is thou shalt not be an adulteress, thou shalt not cheat on thy husband. And so, at the time, they had an adulterous woman. A man could never be accused of adultery, by the way, because a man could have multiple partners. A woman, though, could be accused of being an adulteress. So they got an adulteress, and so the people of the city, the Pharisees and the people of the town thought, right, we're going to catch Jesus out. They passed Jesus a stone. I'm not talking about a little pebble from your driveways. We're talking about great big rocks here. And they said to him, right, your God, your father said you are not allowed to be an adulteress, therefore is punishable by death. Here you go then, you throw the first stone at her. And Jesus gets down in the ground and starts writing things on the floor. We're not really sure what he was writing. He's probably just stalling for a bit of time to think. And he stands up and he says that if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Basically meaning, don't judge somebody else until you judge yourself. Because only when you are without sin can you judge somebody else's sin. And then everybody else walked away. Nobody could throw a stone because everybody had a sin. So nobody could judge them. Whether Jesus would have thrown that stone or not now, we don't know because everybody had left. Was Jesus with sin or not? We're not sure. But everybody else left because they were with sin. And so it's about not judging other people when you are not perfect yourself. And this is where the people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones idea comes from. And so what this shows is this shows justice in that she still did something wrong, but he looked at finding what was the most just way. He showed her mercy and he forgave her. But it also shows a story about how they wanted to catch him out. They did want to catch Jesus out. Because obviously Jesus was saying, turn the other cheek. And they were like, well, how are you going to get out of this one sort of thing? Third column is for service and humility. Put others first and act in service of others out of agape. This is not for reward or praise. We should never think of ourselves as better than others. Service to serve others, to help them. Humility, being humble. A very, very hard virtue to have really is humility. Humility is basically where you do things and don't constantly want praise for it. Or you don't brag about it. It's not, look at me, aren't I brilliant, look what I've done. Being humble is doing these things without asking for something in return. And the example of this is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. Jesus teaches Christians to serve one another. This again was absolutely outrageous that Jesus wanted to do the lowest thing possible, which was to wash somebody else's feet. This was the lowest thing in those days that you could do. Obviously, men wearing sandals in a very dusty, dirty community, never had any pedicures. Their feet were filthy. And so for Jesus, their Lord, their King, their teacher, to say, let me wash your feet, Jesus was showing them, I am humble, I am no greater than you are, let me serve you. Because how can you go serve one another if you won't let me lead by example? And so Jesus washed his disciples' feet. But it is pretty much like the Queen asking to wash your feet. That's how they felt. No, probably not. Fourth one, honesty and integrity. You need to be consistent in your good behaviour and set a good example to others, which includes telling the truth and being true to yourself. Honesty, don't tell fibs. Integrity, have integrity, which means if you believe in something, stand by it. Don't be easily swayed. So it's a bit like somebody saying, I'm a vegetarian, you shouldn't be eating meat, you shouldn't be wearing leather, and then goes home and troughs a bacon sandwich when no one's looking. No integrity. It's about standing by what you believe and being true to yourself. Final column is spirituality, not materialism. You need to be genuine in the love of God and concentrate on spiritual life. We should not put the importance on worldly goods, making us selfish and greedy. Basically, you can have worldly goods, you can have things, that's fine, but make sure you love God more. Do not put your love and your emphasis on possessions. Put your love onto your spiritual life. I think we do one of the examples in business ethics where the man goes to Jesus and says, am I going to get eternal life in heaven? I've done this, I've given to charity, I've been a really good person. And Jesus says, go and give all of your possessions away. And he cries and he says, how can I give everything away? And Jesus says, and then the disciples say, how can we follow this, Jesus? How can we give everything away that we own? And Jesus says, no, the point is that he got so upset when he had to give everything up because he loved his stuff rather than loving God. So you can have things, you can have house and clothes and everything else, you just cannot focus your love upon those things. You, of course, can use that story or the camel story. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. That quote has literal meaning. There is literally a gate in Jerusalem or somewhere like that a camel cannot physically fit through if it's laden with bags going to market. And so they have to take the bags off the camel to get the camel through the gateway because the camel will not fit through with all of its bags and goods going to the market or wherever it might be going. And so what the quote is saying is it's easy for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle, a very, very small opening like the gateway. It is easier for the camel to squeeze through that gateway than for a rich man to get into heaven with all of his bags and riches and wealth. Basically, you cannot take it with you, so don't focus your life upon it. Are there any questions to do with Jesus as teacher, wisdom, any of that? That's the second section. All right, you're doing really, really well. 3 slides left. That's all we've got. 3 slides left. Jesus as rebel. Right, final section then. Jesus as liberator. This one, first part of the slide goes in the first box. Second part of the slide goes in the second box. I'll put it all up there so you can see how much you've got. So that bit goes in the first box. So half and half. Jesus wanted to set the people free from social convention, religious restriction and political domination. Domination. Often Jesus is seen as a religious revolutionary, revolting, pushing against the system and society. Someone who challenged the established religious authorities, institutions and rules with a radically different spiritual message that sought to break down the division between God and the people. Radically because it was extreme. We're talking extremism here. Jesus was pushing against society, pushing against the system, pushing against the political people in order to create a revolution. Jesus had arguments with the Pharisees and the scribes, people with all the power at the time over religious laws, what people should and shouldn't do. He was arrested by the Supreme Court of Justice in Jerusalem, so the Sanhedrin, and he was then handed over to Pontius Pilate for execution. Jesus was a troublemaker. The Pharisees and the scribes did not like Jesus. Often in films, Jesus is portrayed as very mild-mannered, very gentle, quite weak even. No, Jesus was extremely powerful, highly intelligent, and he pushed the buttons of the wrong people. And this has happened throughout history. People that do things and go against the system, people that push against people in authority, end up getting executed. Look at Socrates. He got put in prison, he drank hemlock. People are often done for being heretics or treason, going against the people of the town, the crown, or the politicians, etc. Jesus did just that. Box to the side, Jesus also was seen as a political and social revolutionary. He wanted to liberate people of Israel from the Roman occupation. The Roman-led Israel was awful. Great poverty, we're talking kind of like, again, this Marxist idea, this Hunger Games idea of great poverty with great wealth. The Pharisees, highly wealthy, the market owners, etc., very wealthy with extreme poverty. There was assassinations, there was murders, there was open military rebellions. We're talking about a lot of fighting. One of the groups that would lead the open conflict were the Zealots, and now Jesus had some followers with quite suspicious names, such as Simon. Simon was known as Simon the Zealot, so he was known to associate with people that were open to rebellion. Also, Judas Iscariot. Iscariot means dagger man, dagger meaning knife, which was another name for zealot. So Jesus actually associated his closest people to him were rebels, even criminals. Because again, if you went against the law and broke the law, you were a criminal, by any definition. Two slides left. We're not going to start the next one today, so don't worry. So just keep going as much as you can. You're doing really, really well. What you also have to question is the way that Jesus was understood by his followers changed over time. The way Jesus is portrayed changes. Why do people think Jesus was quite mild-mannered and, I don't want to say weak, but the way that he was portrayed was because that's how the Bible portrays him. The Bible and the early church tried to maybe hide Jesus' revolutionary tendencies so that they were not persecuted. They didn't want to be persecuted for siding with and promoting Jesus' actions. A lot of what Jesus did rocked the boat. And so maybe this was covered over slightly so not to cause further problems. Don't forget it was bad enough being a Christian afterwards anyway. Because obviously after Christ, this is what then led up to Augustine's life, where we then had Constantine that brought Christianity back. But for a long period of time, you were killed if you were a Christian. Excellent. Second to last box. Jesus the political and social revolutionary. When Jesus was arrested, he was labelled the King of the Jews and put to death for a civic crime, not a religious one. Jesus did not do crimes against God, against religion, against Judaism. He was not done for heresy. He was done for a civic crime. Civic crimes, things like stealing. The two next to him were thieves. So the two men he was crucified with were both thieves. So he was done for a civic crime. Basically shouting his mouth about something that they wanted him to be quiet about. Many of Jesus' actions as well can be seen clearly orchestrated as a political move. I'll give you an example in a second. But a lot of what Jesus did, he did for attention. He did to be noticed. Whether this was Jesus himself or the people that were with Jesus, people around Jesus, it's unclear. Because obviously Jesus was focused on the people. But a lot of what he did to get noticed. His disciples were a bit like his PAs. They were the people that promoted Jesus. And so the best example is the example of Palm Sunday. So you know when you used to go to church at Sunday school and used to get palm crosses, this actually, the story of Palm Sunday, has significant political undertones. So write it down and then I'll explain it afterwards. When Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey and the crowd laid cloaks in remembrance of King Jehu and laid palm branches to symbolise the Maccabees who liberated Israel. Many scholars believe this was carefully orchestrated by Jesus and his followers to fulfill Zechariah's prophecy and to send a message that the long-awaited Messiah had come to set Israel free. Don't forget, again, set Israel free means everybody becomes equal. Think of it like the Hunger Games. The rich people or the Pharisees did not want everybody else to be set free. Because then everyone becomes equal, everybody gets the same amount of money, money gets spread and so the rich have to give up what they own. They did not want Israel to be set free. So there was 3 important bits of symbolism within this act. The first was Jeremiah's. Jeremiah was a man that wrote a book in the Old Testament. Jeremiah prophesied that somebody would enter Israel. He would be the Saviour and the Messiah coming to liberate the people of Israel. He would come in on a donkey and people would lay down palm branches. So that was the prophecy. And so Jesus, with his followers, orchestrated it to look like the fulfillment of the prophecy. Maybe it was the fulfillment of the prophecy. Maybe this is what Jeremiah predicted. A prophecy is a prediction. Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey and the crowd laid cloaks down. So cloaks are the robes that they had on. So the disciples started to lay their cloaks on the floor because they didn't want the donkey to walk in all the mud as a sign of respect. But it's also a symbol to King Jehu, who did great things as well for Israel and the liberation. But also the palm branches symbolise the Maccabees who liberated Israel 2 centuries earlier. So everything that they did, Jesus did by entering on the donkey, symbolised either King Jehu, either Zechariah's prophecy, or the Maccabees. All of these symbolic messages would not have gone unnoticed by the Pharisees and the scribes and the people of the time. Jesus got noticed. So much so, they eventually killed him. You only have one more to do. Final slide, final point. Was Jesus a pacifist? 2 boxes, one small one, one larger one. Yes, Jesus was a pacifist. In Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, he obviously says, blessed are the peacemakers. He refused to take up military power. This is Jesus. He refused to take up military power, so entering the army, even though he never criticised people of the army, he never joined the army. And finally, when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, all of his disciples pulled out their swords, and Jesus says, those who take up the sword will die by the sword. Once those that take up the sword will die by the sword. Do not raise your weapons. What actually happens on Jesus' arrest, obviously Judas betrays Jesus and Jesus knows he's been betrayed. Jesus knows he's going to get arrested. That's when they have the Last Supper. and he washes the feet, etc. In the Garden of Gethsemane, one of his disciples takes out a sword and goes to attack one of the guards, but accidentally chops off the ear of one of the servants of the guards. Poor servant. I mean, they're a servant and they get their ear chopped off. And then Jesus goes up and heals the servant. So he heals their ear, and that's when he says, those that take up the sword will die by the sword. So Jesus tells them to put their weapons away, and he goes peacefully. However, maybe not so peaceful. Pacifist obviously means peaceful. Jesus was active in challenging negative impacts of oppression. He spent time with many as well that were oppressed, and he confronted authority. He demonstrated righteous anger by driving out money changers in the temple. However, nobody was ever hurt. Jesus never killed anybody. That's not to say the people that we was with never did bad things. We don't know. But Jesus himself never did. But he certainly wasn't a passive pacifist. He didn't just sit by. He was very, very active. He threw the tables over in the temple when they were making money and gambling. Also, Jesus was crucified next to bandits. Bandits were like Robin Hood style resistance, who often, so social banditry is when people try and overthrow the people in power through violence. So because Jesus was crucified with two bandits, these were very much people that took from the rich to give to the poor, or thieves. Why was Jesus crucified with those two? For a civic crime which is similar. Did they see Jesus like the Robin Hood style? Were they scared of Jesus becoming or joining social banditry? This idea of trying to oppress, trying to overrule the oppression, going against the Pharisees with violence. They were scared. That's why Jesus died. You were sorry, Alfie? Are there any questions? Done extremely well there. Okay, excellent. Well done, everyone.